Recording. Hi everyone. Hi Brenda, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Stella Nyambura Mbau. I'm in Nairobi, Kenya. Brenda's also from Kenya, Nairobi. I founded LOABOWA, that's bringing this class to you in partnership with Village to Nation, who facilitated the masterclass. And now I'm gonna look for my slide. Here. There we go. I'll be your host for this session on climate justice. We'll look at climate injustice, carbon inequality, and climate activism. They're related, as well as how climate injustice has led to climate activism, both here in Africa and globally. As we get started, I hope you have pen and paper. As always, please note down anything that grabs your attention or you think is important for your own reference later. And also, I encourage you to engage one other person in this conversation. That's the whole idea of this class, not only to pass information, but to better your own understanding so that you're confident in what you learned. Yeah, make reference to the Feynman learning technique for that one. Yeah, so here we go. Climate justice is a term that means many things to many people, but at the heart of it is the environment, human activities that are detrimental to the environment and communities that are at the receiving end of negative effects of these activities. That's the Global South, indigenous communities. We just refer to them as MAPA, M-A-P-A, most affected people and areas, because saying Global South is a bit general. Yeah, which generally points to vulnerable people and poor people. Last week, we did an introduction into climate change and global warming in last Saturday's session. The rest of the sessions will also be held on Saturdays, 2 to 4 p.m. Nairobi time. That's to mean we have this and 2 more sessions. Today's session on climate justice, which we'll just go through. Next week, we have climate risks. So we'll do the Kenyan global context. And finally, the final class will be on climate action. Yeah, so we have this question. Let me just do a recap. We're doing climate injustice, carbon inequality, and climate activism today. Climate injustice. Before we start on the topic, there's this question. I'm just curious to know what your opinions are. So we'll be posting questions for you on polev.com. The first question is, what is climate injustice? You could go to polev.com and enter the username LKE050 and answer the question. As I attempt to define it in my own words. We'll review some of your answers after this. Well, my definition. If we could go to the next slide. I think I went to the end. Yeah. To understand climate justice, I find it helps to think of injustice. Yeah, from that point of view. So, well, what is, let's just start generally. Climate change and how is that an injustice? Human activity, we refer to human activity as the main reason for carbon emissions that are causing global warming, then leading to climate change. Other things, well, related to human activities still, which we also refer to as carbon activities, is I'm sure you've heard people talk about system change a lot lately, especially with COVID. System change, what people are referring to here is capitalism, globalization. The monetary system is the specific system they're referring to when they say system change. Because capitalism, we say, is like a hungry beast that is always hungry, and we cannot completely, satisfy this hunger, especially on this planet. The level of resources required, everything is on such a level that we cannot sustain it. And I'm sure you've also seen the campaigns, there's no planet B. So it means that people have to reduce the amount of consumption. I would say mostly in the north, what we refer to as the global north, and this consumption is having a very negative effect, mostly in the global south. This is where you start to see where the injustice comes in. So if you're talking about climate justice, and justice being, for example, if I treat someone justly, I treat people justly, I am just. It means that the way I talk to one person is the same way I talk to the other. There's a standard method, a way of approaching these people, which is just. So when we say climate justice, we're talking about this disparity that climate change is bringing along, that is affecting some negatively more than others. And that shouldn't be. Everyone is deserving of the same level of, for example, if we're dealing with climate change, we should be at the same level of dealing with it. Not some people are more vulnerable than others. Same way with environmental justice, we're talking about, are people able to access healthy food or clean water? And when they're not, it becomes an environmental injustice. So sort of in the same way, climate justice points to the way that climate change is affecting some people more than others. Health-wise, air pollution, it could be water pollution, plastic pollution. We relate a lot of these things to climate change. I would say it's not a direct correlation. It's a direct correlation to human activities, not so much climate change, but we put that discussion in the same general broad area. Like plastics, I would say, when you talk about fossil fuels, that's where you really get it. Yeah, because banning fossil, well, I think I covered it in my last class. I will just give a brief overview. Yeah, fossil fuel is stored carbon because that's stuff that died a long time ago. We all store carbon in our bodies, trees as well, everything that is living. And carbon dioxide, methane, all of these things, just like oxygen, they have to be there on a planet where there's life. The issue with carbon dioxide is that it's gotten to a point where the levels are beyond what they should be. Too much of something is poisonous. That is a scenario. So when you talk about plastics, you get plastics from fossil fuels. So that's how we get plastic pollution. It's mostly a consumption issue, and that is a direct impact of us on the environment. It's a bit disjointed from climate change, but when you go back to the conversation about fossil fuels and our reliance on fossil fuels, then it comes full circle. Yeah, so I think I mentioned capitalism is also, I think, when you think of globalization and these consumption habits. We don't, for example, in Kenya and many other countries, we don't produce oil or drill for oil. I think there's some exploration that I'm not sure has been fruitful, but we don't drill or frack, and yet there's so much plastic pollution here. That means through globalization, through the market, somehow this oil that is manufactured, processed into plastics, finds its way here, where we have nothing to do with the oil itself. So in a globalization sense, plastic pollution is getting here where we're sort of disjointed from the production of oil. So globalization, capitalism make it easy for some ills, societal ills, to be distributed globally, if that makes sense. I think just to go into this system change and monetary system a bit more, I have Jaya. Jaya is a he. For some reason, he did a video, and I think he was a bit conscious about his accent. So, as I think he mentioned it, so he put it in an app and attached a female's voice to it. So this is not his voice. And he's going to go a bit deep into this system change, monetary change. I gave you a bit of a shallow look on it. Let's find the video first.
Fuels, especially oil and gas, are still generating. Imaginary speech of great Greta Thunberg and the global youth strike movements. Getting aware of this towering, massing together, fast developing, gigantic primordial catastrophe and seeing that fossil fuels, especially oil and gas, are still generating the most of financial revenues in the world, seeing that almost all conflicts and wars are in regions where there are the biggest deposits and reserves of them, seeing that there is a denial of most evident scientific findings for simple economic reasons, being afraid to lose their respective position in global power structures. Seeing this all just as few out of many other aspects, I ask myself why humanity, confronted with such a catastrophe threatening mere human existence on this planet, doesn't organize itself solely on the basis of global networks alone, without that there are any monetary, economic interests and constraints interfering. That we try to avert a total unleashing of this catastrophe, to organize this fight about our planetary life world, for our human existence, solely on that basis. In an universal and unlimited cooperation as a global society, in which we exchange and share all the different resources and tasks we have, in which we work together for the benefit of all people on this world, using the capability of the networks in order to identify, calculate and determine the needs and to connect the different individual intrinsic inclinations, bents, tendencies and skills in millions upon millions of different projects and manufacturings, where there might be need of about 25 basic working hours a week for everyone, as a maximum, where we could implement immediately all the so urgently needed massive nature restorations, instead of producing more and more SUVs and trucks. Yes, we have to accomplish tremendous emergency measures, doing these vast and massive ecological restoration, reforestations, creation of wetlands, bogs, nature and wildlife reserves, etc., building a global renewable energy system, modifying the energy supply for houses and buildings, transforming the global mobility system from mass automobility and logistics to sweeping and high clock rate electrified rail-bound systems, replacing air transportation and marine engines with liquid hydrogen drive systems, to restructure the whole of the industries in order to produce durable and higher quality products, to create an entire recycling system for these goods in a circular economy, changing the global agriculture into organic farmings, giving up livestock and dairy farming to a large part, etc. And at the same time the removal of trillions of tons of greenhouse gases from the troposphere, the cleaning up of the oceans, rivers and land masses from all plastic littering, for which only very few years are left, which could only be done in efforts comparable to those during World War II. But all these efforts can't be organized keeping the world's monetary and trade system, together with its current international power structures, in which every nation is in an extreme competition against each other, generating the most finances possible, in which everyone has to struggle primarily for one's monetary, economical existence. Not only because there aren't enough financial resources for such tremendous reconstructions and modifications left in this monetary economic struggle, especially because those would be, in the whole, against the fundamental essence of financial systems, that overproduction, abundance and wasting generates more money, in an endless growth of consumerism, preferably with short-lived products in bulk, and, in the end, that it is much cheaper to burn the most of it or to throw it into the oceans after it is used than to recycle everything. Yes, as a result, and to make it short, everybody who wants to keep our planetary life world and with it our human civilization must focus on to organize this struggle for survival of humanity, solely on basis of global networking, without that any monetary, economical constraints do interfere, without that any traces of the monetary organizational tool are left. This is our last chance and possibility we have in order to do an emergency break, to reduce our lifestyle to an existential, material minimum, until the whole of the industries, the whole way of producing and consuming, the energy and mobility systems and so on, are rebuilt, in a radical change of course, into circular and sustainable economies in accordance with natural processes, evolutions and progresses. Let's see the future, not the past. Imaginary speech of great Greta Thunberg and the global youth strike movements. Getting aware of this towering, massing together, fast developing, gigantic primordial catastrophe and seeing that fossil fuels,
So that's Jaya. Jaya sent us 3 videos. So those are in 3 parts, which I'll play throughout today's session. The first was an overview of the problem, the monetary system. This is where he loves this conversation so much. He's come up with a model, a networking model. We'll have a look at it later. Yeah, just keep an open mind. The second is more about the system change needed. The final bit is, yeah, the sneak peek into the networking system that he's championing. This is a move away from the monetary system. So that was the first part. And I think the main point is the need for system change. He also mentioned extractive activities, the fossil fuel industry. Our reliance on energy is the main reason why we have carbon emissions that I think are the highest we've ever had. And the only way to explain it is human activities. Since the industrial age, if you look at I think it's a killing chart. I like to look these things up. killing curve, the killing curve. KEELING, killing curve. If you go to images, you'll probably, or graph, yeah, killing. Yeah, just look it up, you'll see. Because they show what the carbon emissions have been for millions and millions of years. So when you see how it accelerates towards the 2020s, it is so obvious that we are responsible for the carbon emissions now. For some people, that's difficult to understand. And like I said, yes, carbon dioxide, there's nothing wrong with it. It's naturally occurring. The problem is the levels that we have. That is the bit that is not normal. Yeah, so affected communities, going back to climate injustice all around the world, are now learning to harness the strength in numbers. That is usually what happens when there's an injustice. There will almost always be an uprising. Later, we'll see the relation between climate injustice and climate activism. Yeah, fighting for their lands, because most of these fossil fuels are extracted in places that are very remote, but also customary lands for some people. So their lands, their environment, their home ends up being destroyed. And there's no way to compensate someone when you've destroyed their home. There's really no way. So we have in Kenya an example of the Lamu coal plant that was discontinued, I think, for a really long period of time. It's just not started, and that's because there was a campaign. It's called the decolonize, but with coal instead of coal, decolonize campaign. These are just activist people from this. I remember a lady who gave up her job, I think, with government there, and she joined this campaign. So it's not just the youth, it was family members, people who were educated about what would happen to that environment. They showed up and joined this campaign. Together, they frustrated this building of the coal plant from the beginning, and nothing has happened. Construction of the coal plant was to begin in 2015 and last about 2 years, but that's yet to happen. And the campaigners are, anytime there's a conversation about the Lamu coal plant, they are there to make sure it doesn't happen. So their influence together as a community has been justified with banks pulling out of their financial commitments towards building this coal plant. And obviously, the more that happens, the more it tells these people that yes, our actions, going out to the streets, holding placards, is working. So we see many communities doing this all around the world today. There is the Okavango Delta towards the south of Africa. There's a Canadian big oil company that wants to drill there. And activists have taken that up and have already started to stand and fight against it. There's an East African pipeline that was supposed to come through Kenya actually, but didn't. I'm not sure about the reasons, but we'll go through, I think, Uganda, Tanzania. Yeah, in Australia, the US, Dakota pipeline, everywhere, there's so many pipelines and coal plants that why activists go for these two energy sources, and the companies, the big oil companies that are related to their construction, is because, like I said, energy is the main reason why we have the carbon emissions that we have. So as long as we depend on these sources of fossil fuel, even natural gas isn't necessarily a good alternative, even though some people might peddle it as soon as you ban it, because it's natural, it's from where we have our fossil fuels and carbon stored. As long as it's coming from that source, methane, it it means as soon as you burn it, it will release the carbon that it's stored, and that's not good. What we should be moving into, transitioning into, is green and clean energy, solar, wind, water, which we have. But for some reason, these big oil companies, that transition is not something that they are party to, which they should be if the idea is to provide a service or live on a healthy planet and participate in that. Yeah, so the aim of this masterclass is to get us talking about this so that you're aware of the kind of investments your own government makes and whether they're really investments. In some cases, when you consider the impacts to neighboring communities, the life cycle of a project like this, some of these projects are not worth it in the end. Indigenous communities in these places where pipelines go through are left to grapple with many negative effects, often orchestrated by these international organizations, which is often the case where international organizations that do the drilling exist away. They are far removed from where they are doing the destruction. So they could easily separate themselves from that experience, the negative experience. As far as they're concerned, they're doing drilling of oil to provide energy for, because that's how, if you think about it, urbanization, industrialization, everything we refer to as being developed relies on energy, machinery, everything. Even moving from one place to another, whether by plane or car, most of it is fossil fuel. That's how we live. That's the system we live in. So partly why when we're saying system change, and the need for change of our energy source and moving from fossil fuels to greener fuels, all of this starts to consolidate into one thing. A case that I think is a great success story is that in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where Shell, we have a lot of Shell here, the Shell company, a big oil company, is responsible for environmental degradation from oil extraction processes. I've seen pictures where, okay, so the health implications are very, very direct and very literal. If you've seen pictures of somebody there's a lot of toxicity from this oil that I think people don't talk about, or I was unaware of. It's very toxic. But aside from that, if it comes in contact with your lake or ocean, like I said, this is the Niger Delta. That means that's a water source. So it could easily kill everything that's alive in that region. Forget fishing, forget prawn farming, like everything that is to do with agriculture and living things. Forget about that. But also in the processing of oil, there's a lot of air pollution. I saw a documentary once on the BBC about the Niger Delta itself. And the issue is that this problem is long lasting. It doesn't just happen and goes away. And but with this particular case, what I thought was I liked, this is very recent, The Shell was held accountable for all of that distraction to the Niger Delta in a court of law in the UK, I think, and Denmark. So Shell was ruled liable for all this and owes the Niger Delta compensation, which includes cleanup. When you're processing oil, some of the really crude bits of it are very toxic. Yeah, even skin irritation. And then to think that it's the whole general population of that area that is affected is really an injustice. This is in part why there's a push for, I don't know if you've heard of ecocide. So there's a push for that to be an ecocide, international law. Ecocide being made an international law. So ecocide means the destruction of natural resources deliberately by us. So in that case, Shell, through their activities, destroyed the natural resource around Niger Delta, and therefore you can sue. They are seen to be liable for punishment. Yeah, so there's a push to make ecocide an international crime, rather not law, international crime. I love the idea, and sure, I think most of us should. It's coming a bit late, but it's still very much needed. In the past year, there's been, I feel, too many campaigns dubbed Save This, Save That. There's been Save Nairobi National Park, there's Save now the Okavango Delta, like I mentioned, to the south of Africa. There's Save Bugoma Forest, Uganda. There's Save so many things, which means as we're having these conversations more and more about how to build back better, especially after COVID, there's still people with big bank machinery connections who, in a bid to continue making money, because capitalism, like I said, this people have a hunger for making more and more money. When you make it, it's not enough. You want more. It's like an addiction. And yeah, so they're continuing to push for more and more of these activities, which is more and more distraction. So just because COVID has us reflecting, we want to do better, doesn't mean everyone is with us. And that's why this international law would mean everything. It would change a lot. It would make it easier to get compensated for these environmental disasters that big corps leave behind. Yeah, after they've gotten their resource and then they leave. International meaning big corps will be held. If it's made an international law, it means, like I said, in the Niger Delta, the Shell company was held liable for their actions in the Niger Delta in Dutch, in Denmark and the UK. So anywhere, these companies could be taken to court, which is, regardless of where in the world they choose to operate, they should operate within certain boundaries, which I think is important for them to be. They've just been sort of like an unruly, untamed way of working. So the law would make sure that they are checked. I'm just going back to, yeah, I mentioned the question on Poleb. So we look at it after another video from Jaya. That monotone voice for me is also causing me to drift, but just try to listen to it. I think naturally we're used to listening to human voices. So a robotic one feels weird. Yeah, so this is
threat situation of the world to 10%, nevertheless demands that possible. See on YouTube.
and this is to do with networking system that he thinks that a networking system can replace the monetary system. So like I mentioned earlier, if you've seen placards written system change, not climate change. Another one, a popular one, there's no planet B. It's often pointing to the need for a new normal, for us to do things differently on a scale that we can only imagine at this point, because when we talk about capitalism and consumerism and that being an ever hungry monster that's consuming energy and resources at a scale that is not sustainable, then if I was to deduce that, it means moving away from capitalism. And I feel like for many of us, the idea itself ends there. That's as far as it goes. How is that scalable globally? That's all we know since barter trade. We only know how to deal in money when you go to the shop. That's how you get anything. That's how you're paid for a service. That's how you live, food, water, you have to pay for it. So, but I like to tell you that there is a way to change things, to change the system. It's a tall order, one that feels impossible, but is important to talk about. And it's probably the only way we can move away from the kind of the carbon activities, the level of emissions that we have right now is definitely going to have to be system change one way or another. Yeah, that's, I think the next thing is a question. Yeah, I don't know why the slides are jumping. We had a question on polliv.com. What is climate injustice? So I'll just go and have a look. I have this poll out during the week. Some people who aren't able to come to the actual class post their answers, which I will go through now. There's, okay, what is climate injustice? A situation where those who pollute the least are the most affected by it. I think I get the message. Yes, which is what we're talking about. There was a typo there. Another one, harm that is a result of climate change, because climate change is a responsibility of a few rich and super rich of the world that is affecting the poor and developing countries the most. I think it's pointed to the same thing. Like I said, justice, it implies that there's something that is going wrong. There's it's like a disparity that is being caused by something. And yeah, so the more people are talking about something that is causing some to suffer more than others, you've already hit the nail on the head. I think a good, okay, so this one just started with an example. I think a good example is the communities, such as the ones in the US campaigning against the Dakota pipeline. I mentioned that because their lands are sacred. When you go and drill for oil there and leave the land degraded and the community suffering, then it really isn't fair. There's something very unlawful about that. Same concept, saying the same thing in different words, using different words. Another one, final one. What is climate injustice? Pollution by big economies at the cost of the small ones. Yeah, I think I agree to all of those. They're all saying the same thing, which is I find it interesting. Yeah, which, like I said, is the important thing about being able to communicate something. When you understand it, you internalize it and are able to use your own words to say the exact same thing. But yeah, like they were not using the same words, but they were saying the same thing. Just buying time. We are trying to move from. Where's it? Oh, yeah. Uh, so after the question, we're going to have just going to review that section. I think we've covered most of what you could generally think of in climate justice or injustice. So some of the words, human activities, this is, I would say this is where you should begin with the thought every time you think climate change, every time you think climate injustice, because it's not purely a problem in nature or the environment. We have contributed in a very big way. Yeah, so to think human activities is important. Climate injustice, we've mentioned some of the injustices, especially by the big corps. This is just to try to, in their bid to provide energy, but the way they're doing it is even maybe just the resource that they're tapping into, they shouldn't be. Which leads me to the ecocide law that would see ecocide as a crime. Yeah, which I think is important. And then system change is a conversation that has been there for a really long time. It's not easy. System change is very difficult. We have so many structures, political, everything you think about in the world we live in now is in some form of structure. To 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 even suggest that system change is the way to change the problems that we have to have a different experience on this planet is such a the scale of system change is so huge, and I think it's partly why people don't see this as very practical. I think is what I would say, but it doesn't matter whether practical or not. It's required. That's the point. Yeah, I think yeah, we need to go on a break, but I will leave you with another Jaya video. It's like 2 minutes. It's again the robotic voice, but don't worry about it. It's the last one. The other ones are actual people voices. So yeah, just 2 minutes. I think it's I find just the thought process thinking about something different very interesting for me. The possibility of it. I must mention, Jaya is German. He's from Stuttgart. Now, he was pointing out, we were just having a conversation, and I told him it would be very difficult for anyone here to think not to participate or not to go to work, not to rely so much on the money system, monetary system, because that's how we live, and we don't have social welfare. So if you don't work, there's many things that you're not going to have access to. But he's able to have this conversation, and well, because he has access to social welfare, some of these people, because of that safety net, can really dig deep into these kinds of conversations. And I just feel like just because we have to rely on the monetary system doesn't mean we shouldn't participate in the conversation too, because the idea of system change is good for everyone. Now, I'm gonna try again.
Drafts, ideas, imaginations of a non-monetary world, or of a currency and trade-free one-world society. First, there would be no gigantic upheavals, at least there are already in all drafts, ideas, imaginations of a non-monetary world, or of a currency and trade-free one-world society. First, there drafts, ideas, imaginations of a non-monetary world, or of a currency and trade-free one-world society. First, there would be no gigantic upheavals, at least there are already in all areas of progressive knowledge and developments, which are so far, however, reduced to an idealistic niche existence, sometimes even suppressed. In any case, a much lower duty or basic working time, which would be done, according to intrinsic predispositions, but also by extrinsic motivation, for example through community processes and actions. Certainly, the next decades, with regard to the fastest possible rebuilding of the energy system on a 100% regenerative basis, the material provision in the sense of a circular economy and the biological carbon capture from the atmosphere become very labor-intensive. For immediate, massive reforestation and restoration, the creation of peatlands and bogs, for example the people employed today in the financial and taxation industries, as well as in the arms industries and armies of the world could be addressed. It would be important to free the world from the littering, the consequences of consumerism, the throwaway society and the plastic packing insanity, as soon and as completely as possible to liberate, especially the oceans for the salvation of the marine life, especially whales, as a factor of CO2 capture. A stabilizatio of the wildlife on land and in the water, the coral reefs, a committed counteraction against the mass extinction of species. A changed media world can lead to a rethink, a cultural change and mass actions in this regard. The protection of nature, the preservation, or the restoration of a broad biodiversity, as a basis for the integration and adaptation of civilized sophistication could then be a natural part of any further development. Instead of planned obsolescence and psychic obsolescence, high-quality modular products would instead be produced. The time of overconsumption and waste, the destruction of food and goods will be a thing of the past, which amounts to a huge saving in labor. The value maintenance and repair sector, repair shops and recycling would be given a much higher value. A change to alternative mobility concepts and the widespread relocation of logistics to rail would in historical relationship uncover the current relative nonsense of individual automobile traffic, approximate 10 square meters plus 1.4 tons, SUVs up to 2.5 tons, to transport an average of 1 to 2 people, inclusively with resources and working time to be saved.
Okay, so sorry, I'm laughing at myself. Yeah, I'm looking at yeah, so I think we're done with Jay's robotic videos. He lives in that conversation, as I said, where he thinks about he thinks you can actually replace the monetary system with networking systems. My own very limited understanding of that, I liken it to the circular economy, but without a dependency on the monetary system. I think the circular economy mostly we discuss in the sense of how we use natural resources. So not going back to virgin materials if you can reuse, recycle, or repurpose. So yeah, circular economy, just making use of stuff within the circle uh, and making sure it's completely degraded before you go back to nature to take anything from it. Um, so I imagine that's what he's talking about, just without um, the monetary aspect of it. Still very vague, but yeah, that's what I would say his specialty and what his research is on. Um, because I think it's important to know that we won't change the world going into the future by doing things the same way we have in the past. I think that is it's easier said than done. I think that's the main point, easier said than done. Um, yeah, so this question I have up, our next section is on carbon inequality. So what is carbon inequality? I thought this one was a bit tricky, but I'm still gonna assume people can guess. Actually, we got some guesses already. So the question was, what is carbon inequality in your own words? That's how we posted the question. So even now, I think the question is activated if you want to give it a try. Let's see. Yeah, yeah, it is. You can go to holab.com, LKE050, answer the question if you want to give it a try. I'll go ahead and give it my definition. Then we'll review the answers later. I had an extract, if I can find it. Yeah, let's just go through the extract fast. Then I think you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say carbon inequality. There's a research that was done by Oxfam and the Stockholm Environment Institute. The report, it reports that from 1990 to 2015, the contribution by the richest 10% of the world's population, that's about 63 million people, was 50% of the cumulative carbon emissions. So 10% of the population, 50% carbon emissions. While the poorest 50% people, 3.1 billion, were responsible for only 7% of cumulative emissions. Yeah, so that's 10% of the rich, super rich, anybody you think, Elon Musk's of the world, all of those 10%. 50% emissions, and 50% of the population, 7%. It's such a disparity, and that's sort of what we're referring to as carbon inequality. I will also delve into a conversation about, developing countries and developed countries. Developed countries have gotten to where they are because they built everything on carbon activities. When I say carbon activities, I'm referring to urbanization, industrialization, machinery, big factories. That's how we are able to scale things, a project, even farming. You can't do it without a tractor. All of these run on fossil fuels. So that's what I mean when I say, when I relate developed countries to um, carbon activities and carbon emissions. Yeah, I hope that's clear. Anyway, so when you talk about carbon inequality, we also talk about, we talk about Let's just look here. Oh yeah, carbon activities, I mentioned those. We talk about the global north and the global south. If that's, it's not as easy as, like I said, drawing a line and saying that's the north and this is the south, which is why we use MAPA. MAPA is the most affected people and areas. Usually like Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, around the tropical regions. The other thing we talk about when we discuss climate carbon inequality is how, so these developed countries are more resilient because of these infrastructures and systems that they have in place. So, for example, in Japan, there's an earthquake today, a road is destroyed, it's fallen apart. The next day, I think that road is working just fine. People are going to work as if nothing happened yesterday. So, if the same thing were to happen in Kenya, for example, I think it would take a really long time before that road was back to use. People will actually find another way to use to get to where they're going. And yeah, those are just some of the indicators that show you that some people, some economies are more resilient than others. Something happens and people are on it, they put money into it. You have whatever contractors on site to put the road back in its place, and in a few minutes, as if nothing happened. It's different. So that's a trait of those economies in the global north, developed economies. You cannot say the same for developing countries. The disparity is huge. We also say that vulnerability is really high in global south. Like I said, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. That's the tropics. So yeah, I have lost my trail of thought, but because I got another thought, with climate change, most of the, okay, there's two things. The cause for climate change is, we go back to the 10% producing the 50% emissions. We say that it's mostly these economies, the developed country, that's responsible for climate change. Africa produces about 3 to 5% of carbon emissions, I think annually, 3%. Even if we went to zero overnight somehow by tomorrow, it would not change anything globally with climate change. We will still have climate change tomorrow, even if Africa went to zero. So it's not so much that, yeah, we do not consider Africa a carbon contributor. That's one thing. The second thing is the consequences of climate change. They are affecting mostly people in the global south, that tropical region that I mentioned. I think it's to do, yeah, it's just a climate issue around the tropics. We have warmer weather. That means if it's getting hotter, then the deserts are getting hotter and hotter, they're drier. If we're talking about rainfall and yeah, the two most prevalent climate change events are floods and droughts. So if it's getting hotter, yeah, the droughts are going to be more and more reinforced. As for floods, the changing climate systems, that's going to stay. Yeah, and it's happening. The worst hit is Southeast Asia. We talk about Africa being the most vulnerable because it's our political structures. There's a lot of other stuff like our ICT and infrastructure is a lot less developed than Southeast Asia, even though Southeast Asia is at a higher climate risk. We in Africa are at a higher vulnerability to climate change. You could say corruption. There's a lot of other things that don't work just right here, and they add on to the vulnerability. That's how we get to be more vulnerable, even though we're not at the highest risk. Giselle. Yeah, international agreements like the Paris Agreement, I think the aim, this disparity, the carbon inequality is obvious. It's obvious, you don't even need the figures. But when you have them, I think it's easier to communicate. So the Paris Agreement, when they talk about compensating the global south, not just for the suffering that they're going through with climate change caused by the global north, not just for that, but also to enable the south to adapt. Adaptation needs infrastructure, you need systems, you need to install stuff for you to adapt. And that's how the developed countries have gotten to be resilient, because they have structures in place. The South, not quite there. Yeah, and I'm reminded of a concept. I have to confirm this. I think it's the contraction and convergence concept. It's a 1980s concept. Now, I'm going to try to, it's not very easy to understand, but I'm going to try to explain it. That's the whole point of communicating this class, is to try to communicate stuff, and hopefully I will understand it better myself. So contraction and convergence, it's a group of scientists that came up with this concept in the 1980s. You would think a very long time ago, very progressive idea. I don't know why it wasn't implemented, why no one's talking about it today. I don't know why it went like swept under the carpet, but it's just because making the change to reduce our carbon emissions is really difficult, especially for the economies in the north. I think it's difficult for them to commit to producing less. Can you imagine the kind of lifestyles they live? They they can access that lifestyle because of their reliance on these fossil fuels and the carbon emissions that are related to these fossil fuels. They are sort of trapped in that lifestyle. I think to get out of it is really difficult. To get them to commit to reducing their emissions has been just as difficult. Yeah, that's why we talk about the UN conference of parties. It's not been very successful, because that's the main point. You want to bring people to the table to say, you guys are going to reduce this amount of emissions, and these other guys this much, so that we reduce our emissions, so that we don't get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, my God, centigrades. Yeah, and that is almost impossible, because nobody wants to commit to reducing their emissions. Yeah, so let me take you back to the contraction and convergence, because if I get lost. So this concept was that you have, let's just talk about them in global north, global south. Yeah, so the global north, the developed guys with the monies, the resilient ones, who use carbon, who rely on carbon emissions to be at the level they are at. The idea was for them to reduce their emissions. This is a concept, just trying to recollect as I explain. For them to reduce their emissions, while the developing and global south, sort of struggling economies, for them to increase their emissions so that they can adapt. Like I said, adaptation means infrastructure systems. It will definitely mean in the system we live in right now, if you want to get to adapt and install these infrastructures that I'm talking about, you need fossil fuels. That's just the world we live in. The machinery that you will need to build the highways, all of that runs on fossil fuels. So they knew that. So they were talking about these guys being allowed to increase their emissions to a certain level, um, for them to catch up with uh, being developed just a little bit, have infrastructures in place for people to be better able to manage climate risks. Um, so obviously this adaptation, it has, it's a socio-economic type of nexus. So while you have infrastructure, obviously people will be better able to run their businesses. So it means the economy, um, so on and so forth. So people have more money in their pockets, which means better health, better access to food and water, all of that. So we're talking about all of that when I say increase their emissions to adapt, to be more resilient. So yeah, for these guys to drop, for these guys to increase, the idea is for them to get to a point where they are both somewhat able to face climate change somewhat the same way, because right now there's a lot of disparity. It's not we're not facing climate change the same way, and the global south is actually at a greater risk, more exposed. Um, so to think that we also don't have things in place to reduce this risk is crazy. So we're facing risk with no shield. Those guys aren't facing any risk, and they have all the shields in place. Um, so that's what carbon inequality in a nutshell is. Anyway, so at this point, then, when each is sort of equally able to face climate change, the idea was then for both to drop to, I don't know what level, I don't remember, but that was the general idea, contraction and convergence. Why it makes so much sense. This is, it was, someone reminded me of the concept very recently, and I decided to look into it some more. I knew about it in passing, but yeah, that was Anne. She's a professor, so it makes sense that she would be the one telling me. Um, I thought it made so much sense. It was such a progressive thought for the 1980s. That is not the conversation today. If you see in like the Kenyan nationally determined contributions, you see that Kenya was already committing to reduce carbon emissions when I don't think that should be the conversation. Again, going back to that contraction and convergence concept, what the global north should be encouraging the south to do is increase emissions in adaptation and just to be able to work towards resilience. The north, on the other hand, should be the one reducing their emissions in such great amounts that gives the south an opportunity to spend some more. Just think of it as a carbon budget. Um, yeah, so as long as that conversation is not, that in itself, the conversation is not fair. Some of the activists actually talk about this. What I find interesting is I've come across activists from the global north who are the ones championing this and saying that it's unfair. So even though in Kenya or in Africa, people aren't that aware just yet, aware enough to even stand for themselves and say, no, what needs to happen is I need some carbon actually, because I need to get to some level where you're at. And I'm not. And it's not my fault that I'm here. It's actually yours. So you can't be telling me, we haven't gotten to that point. And I feel like for every person that I've met in the global north who's championing that injustice, calling out. Anyway, they're choosing to stand on our side and champion these rights for us, which I find it's moving to some very, not remotely, but very much, yeah. Because I think that's the main point when we talk about justice and seeing carbon inequality as one of the climate injustices. Not one, it's the main, like the founding proposition. Yeah, for people to look at it and say, I come from this side, from the global north. I can see what's happening to you because of what our companies, our industries have done to you guys, and going and demonstrating, and they're showing up with placards at these big oil company offices on our behalf, even sometimes without us knowing. So I find that very inspiring. Have I gone through all points? Yeah, so let's see. I think the next thing is a question. Not yet. We have Chinzia. Oh yes, as I'm talking about other people championing these rights on our behalf. I heard Chinzia talking about it's carbon inequality, yes. She was talking about the responsibility that the North has towards the South, and I felt I wanted her voice in this. I wanted to add her opinion. So we're gonna listen to Chinzia in a bit.
Hi everybody, I am Chinzia.
So the following is Chinzia Alberti, a renewable energy expert from Hamburg. She's Italian, but she lives in Germany. I think she's working there. She also hosts a podcast. It's called Stories of Climate Injustice. Stories of Climate Justice. Yeah. So she's sharing her views on how the global north is responsible for suffering in the global south. And if I could just
And I am Italian. Hi everybody, I am Cinzia and I am Italian, but I currently live in Germany, in Hamburg. I want to tell you a little bit about how I believe that the global north is responsible for suffering of the global south. I think that the global north has been responsible for centuries and for many reasons. I am myself a product of the privileged European society, whose economy and lifestyles developed really fast because of exploitation of natural resources and labor of other continents, like Africa or Latin America. Of course, these were clearly evident during colonialism, but also today, because the political and economic power of the global north keep being exercised. So that now we talk of post-colonial or neo-colonial structure. When it comes to climate change, the global north has the biggest share of responsibility because it is accountable for the biggest chunk of historical emissions that led to global warming and the current climate crisis. The injustice, though, lies in the fact that even with the biggest share of responsibility, the global north faces less extreme consequences due to climate change. When we think about extreme weather events, scarcity of water, or loss of biodiversity, we still have decades in Europe or in the US. We talk about 2050 or the end of the century, to reach the maximum increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, as the Paris Agreement states. While the most vulnerable population in the global south is already facing and is already suffering and exposed to these events. I also think about migration and how many climate refugees are already in the world, and how many people have been displaced because of droughts and floods and scarcity of food due to climate change. And we don't even recognize them or talk about them. I believe that this is what we talk about when we think of climate justice, or in this case, climate injustice. The damage that the global north has caused to the people of the global south is huge. And it's time to hold these countries accountable for their historical behavior, and it's time for reparation and giving back after centuries of exploitation. I wish that all of these can be acknowledged by our leaders in the global north, but also that this level of conversation could lead to more leverage for the countries in the global south to really and finally break the pattern of injustice. Hi everybody, I am Cinzia.
Um, yeah, so that was Chinzia. I think she said most of the same things I was saying. Yeah, because like I said in the last class, there's no way to bend the truth. The truth will always, because it's facts, people will keep saying the same things, different words, but gravitating towards the same thing. So we go back to the question. I have some guesses, I believe. I didn't think I would get any, but I did. If I could just find them. So the first was carbon inequality. Okay, so the first, naturally, some places have more carbon than others. No. Carbon inequality. I see why they thought that. Like when you're drilling for fossil fuels, some places are said to have the reservoirs, some places don't, or they're easier to explore. I don't know what the conversation around exploration of oil is. And what they did is they translated carbon directly into fossil fuel and reserves. Naturally, some places have more carbon than others. If I was to change anything here to make it correct, I would say some places use more carbon than others. And I think that would be accurate. Yeah, the next is very short, refers to capitalism. Carbon inequality enhanced capitalism. Well, sort of. It needs a bit more words to explain, but in a nutshell, yes, capitalism. That's how we have developed economies that are reliant on energy. Yeah. Third, some governments have the upper hand with things like fossil fuels and natural gas, while other governments don't have the capacity to explore these resources. I think when you are accurate to some extent, because the more these economies grow, they have the machinery and financial backing to explore oil because it needs a lot of money. But now you see, this is after the fact. After they have become developed, then these governments are better able to explore fossil fuels, because also somehow they got to it before the South, the global South. Some governments have the upper hand with things like, I think this is secondary. It's not the primary way of looking at it. Sorry, there's someone sweeping. I don't know if it's distracting, but yeah. The other one is we have the amount of carbon contributed into the atmosphere not being similar across the board when looking at different countries' emissions. So developing countries, for example, produce far less carbon emissions due to reduced consumption and or different modes of energy production as compared to their developed counterparts. I'm reading it again. The amount of carbon contributed into the atmosphere not being similar across the board when looking at different countries' emissions, I think is spot on. That's exactly what the disparity is. Especially when I pointed out the 10% and the 50%, 10% reach producing 50% emissions. I think that's exactly the point. So developing countries, for example, produce far less carbon emissions due to reduced consumption. And that's our final one. Let's go back to the slide. For a review of that section. We have carbon activities, carbon inequality. Yes, we're looking at carbon activities as being the main source, and MAPA being the ones that are suffering because of climate change, a result of the emissions from the north. They're suffering because of their vulnerability. And this vulnerability, depending on where you are geographically, there could be different reasons for the vulnerability, but usually it is a monetary, the lack of finance issue. And you could extrapolate or retrospectively take it back to colonial times. There was some systems that were set up back then that keep developing countries always a step back because they were set up in a certain way. So this vulnerability could point to very many things, but it's that. And then there's international agreement. We talk mostly about the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the concept, the contraction and convergence concept, I wouldn't leave it behind. It was a very level-headed argument for very, very early on, 1980s. I was not alive. And so we're going to take another short break. Just because my voice needs a break.
Hi, Stella. Sorry for taking 8 minutes of class are left, so I don't know how long you are looking to continue, but you're the host. I'm going to step out. But Brenda, first of all, thank you for everything. Just talk to the dev, he's sorting out things, and I'll reach out to you. And Brenda, is it okay if I call you on Monday sometime? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, sounds good. Yep, that will be fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, no worries.
All right. Yep. Okay, guys, I am going to leave, but you guys have fun. Then we'll talk.
All right.
Okay.
Stella, if it's okay, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I had a bit of a question,
Yeah. Sure.
kind of linking the last two topics.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah, as I ask, you can rest a little. So I was just wondering, recently we've seen sort of climate interesting patterns in the global north, where, for example, Athens, there's an area that faced its first snow in over 100 years. Texas had a crazy storm that was out of line. There've been it's almost as if, as much as we say yes, the global south is facing quite a bit of issues in terms of vulnerability, and we do have a lot of problems, especially around flooding. Our lakes have had issues recently, but then it feels like climate change has now sort of turned a corner and it's affecting people more across the board. And so some of these more developed or richer countries are now starting to feel the pinch. What are your perspectives on that? And do you think that it will affect a lot of what we're talking about today?
Um, I think the what I would like to call you back to, reel you back in, is when we talk about climate change, we talk about, we lean more into the more prevalent ones, the more prevalent events. So here I'm talking about droughts and floods. Those are the most prevalent. And then after that, I think you can go wildfires in the US, Australia, even Africa, but floods and droughts so are the most prevalent. That's why we say Africa and Southeast Asia, because that's where you find these two. Now, everywhere else is definitely getting some other level of climate risk. Everybody is already facing some level of it. Just ice melting in the Arctic snow will mean sea level rise, and that will be all coastal areas. There's what other example can I think of? Yeah, I think with that one for Texas, I think it caught very many people off guard. I remember seeing turtles being taken to some, yeah. It is, I would say it's becoming, what's happening, it's becoming more coordinated. So it's affecting more and more people, more and more geographically separate, different places experiencing different things. It's going to become more and more coordinated. So you're going to see a lot more of that, not necessarily the same thing as snow. Okay, so climate change means changing climate systems. That means wind patterns and rainfall will change. Very recently, I'm sure you've heard, there was Sahara Desert was carried north, so it landed in Germany or something. So this is a place that, I mean, dust in Germany. It sounds weird, and then it's just dust. It's not necessarily like the heaven fell or something. It's, but you see, if it's a place that doesn't experience dust, and dust is coming from the Sahara Desert, first it's a pollution. It's that's air pollution. Just something happening where it doesn't usually happen, which is going to continue happening more and more. This is how we got locusts. Apparently, scientifically, it was rainfall was supposed to, rainfall has patterns that we are used to, but that's changing. So rain came and fell somewhere in the desert where it doesn't usually fall. And desert locusts started to multiply because of this. Now, when it gets humid and it's hot, it's really good for breeding. So out of nowhere, you have a locust invasion just because rain fell somewhere it wasn't supposed to fall. So I feel like, yes, you're going to have a bit of these really weird looking things happening. And they will be all over the place. And Africa is not excluded from that random stuff that's happening. But the main ones, the floods and the droughts, yeah, those ones we know where they're mainly happening, around the tropics. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it really does. I had no idea about the droughts and the flooding being
Okay,
the main concentration, so that was really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Let's see. She said we have 8 minutes. I still have a whole nother section. Anyway, yeah. Just going on a short break to drink some water because of my voice, and then I will be back. These things lay on top of each other in such a way. Okay. 2 seconds. Okay, I'm back. Yeah. So we're moving to our last bit, climate activism. I think I've mentioned it actually throughout, so maybe this is just a recap type of thing. Let's find the slides. Oh, yeah, the poll. What is climate activism? So before I go into the section, to give you my own definition again, you could go to the poll. Let me activate the question. Let's see. Yeah, what is climate activism? In your own words, what is climate activism? Yeah, so I'll go ahead. I feel like activism, this to me is just fighting for underprivileged somebody else that's maybe suffering a consequence that you know about, or yeah, it's just like the idea that there's an injustice, and somebody else feels the need to stand and voice it on behalf of somebody else or for themselves. Yeah, I feel like that's in a nutshell activism. And so climate activism would be to address a climate injustice. Yeah, so in light of these injustices that we've talked about, activists like I mentioned in the Lamu coal plant, have found a voice. Some fighting for themselves, for their own, others standing up for others, like you had. Is that climate activism? Okay. The spelling is wrong. I just saw that. Okay. So some fighting for themselves, others standing up for others, like you heard Chinzia talking. So most of what it's been is that, well, let's see, we call it self-organizing, like the movements. If you've heard of Fridays for Future, if you've heard of, I would say Extinction Rebellion as well, but I'm not too sure about that one. But they are devolved. They're decentralized systems. We call them self-organizing because it's just people coming together, common cause, and creating a machinery around that, where some people do this, others do this, and work together like an organism. Yeah, so creating platforms where they found strength in numbers, becoming more and more powerful together as sort of tools for change, if you'd like to think of them as such. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so I think this is a rhetorical question, but before I go there, I think I've mentioned activists, self-organizing. It's just groups of people who share the same thoughts coming together, maybe for an injustice, one that is specific, or broad term environmental injustices or climate injustices. So you could find that one group is campaigning, has different kinds of campaigns, but they're all, the central thing is environment, nature, climate change. Yeah. So what I'm seeing is why I wrote it here is voice for the voiceless. This is happening a lot. I think I've noticed very recent months, people actually not just fighting for themselves, and I'm talking about the global north. They're starting to ask questions like, how can we help you get heard? How do we help you and your campaign? How, yeah, we, like, the world needs to listen more to you. And if they have a platform, they want to use it to do that. Yeah, so I think at this point we can go to, this is just a rhetorical question. What is, yeah, it's a question I'd like to leave you with after this section of on activism. What injustice to nature would you say triggers you? Some people, like seeing animals being killed triggers them. It's very personal. For some people, it's seeing hungry children. We used to see images of that very much when we were small. Yeah, stuff like that. Have you had one that made you feel like you wanted to do something about it? Yeah, there have been many environmental campaigns, especially in the past year. I think some have been endorsed by Hollywood celebrities. So I just want, yeah, I went hanging for a minute. Yeah, some have been endorsed by Hollywood celebrities, like Rihanna was supported there was an Indian uprising very recently. Jane Fonda is like with just climate change generally for a really long time. She's been wearing the same dress, I think she's on, same dress to her red carpet shows. Leonardo Dicaprio also I didn't know he was involved, but yeah, he is. I saw a tweet he did, I think, on Save the Okavango Delta. So I feel like people are getting more and more involved, and it's the same thing, like what triggers you. So um, I imagine you have an idea of the kind of campaigns I'm referring to. So we have, let me see, we'll look at, oh, this one's correct, activism. We'll look at some questions right after. So we have a final video from Saini. Saini, he presented in the first class. He's passionate about agriculture, soil chemistry, agroecology, anything agroforestry. He farms himself and he's engaged in climate action with Extinction Rebellion. I would say he's very willing to work with others and very proactive and also very well educated. I think it's more like a self-education. He's educated himself on climate change and the issues we have. So he'll be sharing his views on climate injustice and how that's led to climate activism. I'm hoping for an African perspective. Yeah, so here we go.
My name is Saini and I am from the Republic of the Gambia. My topic of discussion today is how climate justice has led to climate activism. First of all, I started my climate activism when I watched some documentaries of rising seas and the disappearing islands of the world, with a particular focus on mostly affected peoples and area. And my country, the Gambia, capital city, will be underwater by the end of the century. And many people that are living in the capital city will have to migrate. Therefore, they will be termed as climate refugees, of which nobody wants. And in many parts of the world, especially Mapa, many people have to become climate refugees. If you look at the Pacific Islands, there are various countries that have been threatened by sea level rise, and sea level rise also will threaten food security globally, and hunger is increasing at an alarming rate. The UN warned that 820 million people go to bed hungry, and the projection is set to rise by 2030, thereby making the UN set target for zero hunger difficult to achieve. All this is related to the climate crisis, the CO2 emissions. Our islands are disappearing, soils becoming drier, people moving from one area to another, especially herders and searching for pasture for their farm element, which is causing conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen conflicts in Chad, conflict in Nigeria due to herders that are moving from their own place to another place to help their cattle have some pastures to eat, and is causing some conflicts with the local. All this is because of soils are becoming drier, rain is not coming, there is drought, which is causing severe food loss to many people in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are part of the reasons why I'm advocating for climate justice. And I want the world, especially the G7 nation, to really make good ambitions and to help poorer nations shift from fossil fuels to renewable energies or more cleaner energy. Helping humanity strive should be our main priorities, especially for those that have voices. And they should speak for the voiceless. And I hope that someday we will live in a world peacefully without climate crisis. Once again, my name is Saini and I am from the Gambia. Thank you.
again, I like the way the message is consistent. People seem to be saying the same things. Yeah. And I think we can review this section. He's mentioned migration and hunger, world hunger. I want to look at those in our next class when we talk about climate risks. We'll have the global context, African and Kenyan, which is very close to African. Yeah, so he also mentioned MAPA. Yeah, some of the activists have just gotten used to saying it, MAPA. I don't think it's a common thing. Not many people might be aware of it, but yeah, it just means most affected people and areas. Yeah, to review that section, climate activism, I think also Saini, he talked about activism, he talked about injustices. I don't think he connected the two. I will try to do that. And I think he mentioned it as what he's doing, but I feel like in passing. Yeah, so when he's pointing out to the wild hunger, the soils and the migration and everything that's happening, and hoping for a better world, his part is actually an activist. His part to play is being the voice that communicates these things. So he's standing in the gap for he hasn't had to migrate himself, but he can see that his own city might be submerged in the near future, maybe, and already starting to internalize the risk, the threat to his place where he lives. And it's not just a Gambian problem, it's global. So yeah, I can tell you that he's actively standing up. Yeah, he's an activist. He's standing up for his people and globally and in XR Africa as well. I think he's a liaison, which means he's very young. I think he's 24 years old. So he's analyzing things and proactively trying to address them at the level which he can engage, which is educating himself and participating in campaigns and talking about it, which is the most, creating awareness, the most important part to play for anyone who doesn't have the resource to engage in anything else beyond that. It's accessible to everyone, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so activism, injustice, it's a very broad spectrum term, injustice, but we talked about climate injustice and how it's causing the drift. There's people who are well off, those who aren't, and climate risks are exposing those who aren't to even more than they are able to handle. Movements here refers to, I think the most common ones are Fridays for Future. That was started by Greta Thunberg, and Extinction Rebellion, that is a bit more decentralized. I can't think of one person who's at the center of it. And then we have, here we have campaigns. So activism, if you're standing up for something, it will usually lead to some action. So climate activists are known for strikes, climate strikes. There's a global strike pegged for the 19th of March, in just a couple of days. Yeah, so strikes, placards, and on the placards you will see most of the the campaigns are geared towards what the placards say: system change, not climate change. You will find there's no planet B. And obviously, when it's a bit more specific, like say Bugoma Forest or no plastic pollution, all of these things, campaigns will be different, but really the same. The content is the same. And I have non-violent here because most of these movements and campaigns this is how they do them. They're supposed to be non-violent actions. And because most of, like in Africa, Kenya, our governments, I think, are very resistant to these kinds of uprisings, even the climate ones, even though they're being done by the youth, sometimes kids. But I think it's important to point out that they are non-violent. It's not supposed to instigate or cause alarm, I think, is the main point. Yeah. They are very careful to point this out when they're engaging people. It's supposed to be non-violent actions. Yeah, I think I can move to my conclusions now. At the global scale, global scale of things, all the injustices point to an urgency. I think mostly in the global south. In Africa, for example, I feel decarbonization shouldn't be asked of Africa. It doesn't make sense to me. And the statistics also support that. But adaptation should be urgent. I feel like that message, people should know, people in policy making or in government, whoever is teaching even or creating awareness, this is important. Because when the global north is saying they need to decarbonize and you get trapped in that bubble, and you don't need to. Like I said, actually, Africa needs some allocation, some carbon budget allocation, if that is accurate, just to get to some level of development, to be able to fight off some of the climate risks. So to get trapped in that bubble of decarbonizing would be, again, I don't think wise. Yeah. Okay, so next Saturday, we are going to look at, I had mentioned this earlier, climate risks. We are going to look at the global context and then the African context. So the global context would be, I think this one's like when I say Australian wildfires, everybody knew what that was. At the same time, we had Congo forest fires. They were underreported. I don't know what the situation is right now, but those continued for quite a while. Yeah, I think when we talk about African context, there was an Ida cyclone in Mozambique that caused a lot of destruction. And, because of their level of vulnerability, they took a really long time to bounce back from that one, if they ever did, that is. And this is after a lot of foreign aid being pumped into it. So yeah, and we'll look at the Kenyan context. We have locusts to talk about, mudslides as well. Yeah, so I'd like to mention, I'm sure you've noticed that most of the presenters are male. Actually, even in the last class, I started out with 50-50 slots for both ladies and gents. But as I as I go on with going through these classes, I can't help but feel weird about how little ladies showed up. I think I actually had more slots for women, but it's not found out for various reasons. But I've reached out trying to correct that. I've reached out to a couple of friends. Hopefully this will change in the next classes. If it doesn't, forgive me. I'll need a different strategy next time. Maybe plan for 3 times more ladies just to balance out. I find it weird. Anyway, yes. And from the class, if you need more depth and practical application exercises, we plan to have a boot camp sometime working on it. For like 16-year-olds to 23-year-olds, we might accommodate others. I don't know. I'm still thinking about it. And then I think, yeah, this is just for the general public. Write to us, tag us at I am LOABOWA. I know Brenda doesn't do social media. Give us feedback on the class, or simply tell us what climate justice means to you. Yeah, finally, you can also find these classes on LOABOWA's YouTube channel. We haven't posted them up yet, but we will in due time. Yeah, so see you next Saturday, same time, same place. And thank you for being here. Yeah.